The Aston Martin Valkyrie is one of the most eagerly anticipated road cars ever. Designed by F1 genius Adrian Newey, it promises to be extraordinary. But so far, hard facts have been a bit thin on the ground. Now, however, we're here at Cosworth to see and hear for the first time one of the most crucial parts of the Valkyrie, its engine. So here it is, in all its glory. 6.5 litres, 1,000 brake horsepower at 10,500 RPM, a naturally aspirated V12. But as exciting as those numbers are, and as beautiful as it is to look at, static, sleeping, that's not what we want. We want to hear what it sounds like. So here it is. Pretty extraordinary, I think you'll agree. Fairly obviously from this unfiltered buzzsaw yowl, revving over 2,000 RPM higher than a Ferrari 812 Superfast, this is no normal road engine. It's not even a normal supercar engine, whatever that might be. So, to get all the details about how this completely brand new V12 has been designed, we spoke to Bruce Wood, the managing director of Cosworth. Let's start off with the fact this didn't actually start as a V12, because the first ones you tested were a 3-cylinder, is that right?
That's right, absolutely. We know that to go from a blank screen to having the first running engine was going to be of the order of 12 or 13 months. And because of the sort of conflict of needing to meet emissions and needing to deliver such a high power per litre, we knew there was a very big challenge there. What we did not want to do is wait 13 months to prove to ourselves that we'd met that challenge. So we took a 4-cylinder engine that we already had, and we designed and manufactured a 3-cylinder cylinder head for that, which was an absolute replica of 3 cylinders of the Valkyrie design. And we were able to get that up and running within about 5 months. So from the start of the program, we had a 3-cylinder engine, which was an absolute quarter of the Valkyrie, because we have 4 catalysts, so each catalyst serves 3 cylinders. So by running a 3-cylinder engine, we were able to replicate every part of a genuine quarter of the finished article. So I say, within about 5 or 6 months of starting the program, we were able to say, yes, we're going to be able to deliver emissions and performance. So that 3-cylinder delivered both 250 horsepower and an emissions pass, effectively. So that gave us a little bit of breathing space for the next 7 months, knowing that we weren't going to go back to the drawing board and fundamentally go back through all of our combustion simulation again.
Now, I believe we'll get onto the carbon fibre on top in a minute and stuff, but actually, you were saying that this is possibly the most complicated part of the whole engine.
Yes, because the engine is unique in the vehicle in being it's the only road car in the world with a fully structural engine. So by fully structural, it's motor racing Formula One experience. So basically,
literally, if you took this out, then
exactly. Take the engine out, and there's nothing joining it just flops down on the road. There's nothing joining the front and rear if you take the engine out. So very unusually, not only does the engine structure and architecture have to sustain the internal loads generated by 12 explosions inside, but it has to take all of the vehicle loads. In a vehicle like this, with Adrian Newey at the helm, then aerodynamic loads were always going to be enormous. And so the aero loads, if you imagine, are trying to break the engine out of the car. So they're putting these top mounts in compression, the bottom mounts in tension. The gearbox bolts rigidly onto the back of the engine. All of the suspension loads go into the gearbox, go into the engine. So all of the cornering loads are trying to twist the engine off the back of the car. It's a V12, so it's pretty long. So you've got to take all of those loads from here into here, and that was a really hard job. The stiff part of the engine is always from the top of the cylinder head downwards, because you've got quite a considerable sort of architecture in the cylinder head, and then when you get into the V, you've got this kind of torque tube, which is a nice structure for stiffness. But you've got to get those loads from here all the way into that stiff part. And so design of this cam cover, which you might think would be a straightforward part in an engine, actually turned out to be a huge task.
And it's obviously something, I mean, the DFV all those years ago.
Yeah, the DFV pioneered that methodology of the engine being the structural part of the car.
But you said before that they're all single-seaters. And this is a
complicated it enormously, because I say we're very familiar with how to make a single stud or a 4-stud structure work in a race car. But yeah, normally you're just trying to span one pair of fairly narrower shoulders than mine. In a 4-seater, you're trying to span 2 occupants. And so these engine mounts, which have to align with the stiff part of the tub, so the engine mounts have to be fairly closely aligned with the edges of the tub. So that pushes these mounts way out from the stiff part of the engine. I'll say that was quite a challenge.
And you're saying that other things you had to work around, so there's some machining on the parts here.
Every part of the engine bay, if you like, is filled with a lot more than just the engine. So as you say, there's some proof machining there, because the radiators come up here and actually overlap a lot of the cylinder head architecture here. Amazingly, the torsion bar springs actually come up here and run along this part of the centre V and extend right up to about here. Every element of the packaging super tight. Again, sort of right down under here, diffusers are enormous. The diffusers come right up here and tuck right in close. These are the scavenge pumps for the dry sump. 12 bays are scavenged, front covers scavenged, rear covers scavenged, cylinder heads are scavenged. You need a lot of scavenge pumps, but again, they have to be tucked right in close, right down as far as you can. So kind of every part of the engine bay is occupied by something, and not always engine.
And there's something sort of missing from the front here that you might normally expect to find. You've moved round to the back, which I gather Adrian Newey wasn't entirely happy about.
Yes, so the engine revs to say just over 11. That determined that we needed a gear drive for the cams. So to make a chain drive work at that speed, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it's yes, it would be highly risky. Yes, a gear drive is a better solution, and all race engines are gear drives. So we're very familiar with that. But as the engine goes through, speed range from idle up to 11,000 plus, it goes through many different resonances. And so across the backlash of the gears are always rattling across those backlashes. And that creates noise, creates an element of vibration. Normally, you would choose to have the drives on the front of the engine, because that gives you a fractionally shorter and a fractionally lighter engine. So that's the starting point. Going back to what we were saying earlier about this being a structural element of the car, these 4 points are bolted rigidly into the back of the tub. Well, the back of the tub, imagine it's like a sort of skin of a drum, it's a large diaphragm. By having the gear drive at the front here, all of that noise of rattling across the backlashes would have transmitted in the tub. We did a lot of work with Southampton University noise studies, and there was no question that putting the gears at the back was better for NVH. You have this full length of the engine in which to dissipate some of that. But it was certainly quite a debate with Adrian as to the fact that it would be slightly longer and slightly heavier.
And one of the stories I particularly like about it, it is beautiful up here, as you said. It has to be a beautiful engine. It can't just be effective. It's got to be lovely when you do eventually see it underneath the skin. But as lovely as this is, Adrian Newey wasn't entirely happy with the way that this looked. Explain.
Well, certainly when we first discussed this, Adrian was slightly alarmed by the high polish finish, and his first question was, how much does that lacquer weigh? From memory, the lacquer weighed something like 80 grams, and that was 80 grams too much. So it's now going to be an option in the car. You can have your fully lacquered plenum, but you can have the option of a non-lacquered plenum to take the weight out. And that's been the beauty of the whole thing. Adrian had a very purity of vision from the beginning, and that's infectious. That purity of vision is what's driven the whole thing to be what it is. And I think we talked earlier about the weight of the engine. The weight target was hugely ambitious.
So the target was 200
kilograms, and we've ended up a couple of kilograms over that. But by setting that 200 kilograms, if we had have said 210, which would have been a lot easier, we would have been at 210. By setting 200, we've ended up at just a couple of kilos over than that. And that's how the whole program has worked. We've set targets which are a little bit beyond what we think we can actually deliver. And I say it's that target setting and that kind of purity of purpose that will go down in history as one of the great iconic engines and cars.
But this is obviously it's not just a pretty piece sitting on top.
So the plenum obviously has to contain all of the sort of dynamic movements from the pressure wave up and down the plenum. So if you imagine you've got 12 trumpets in there, sucking air, 1 fraction of a second, and then with the valve overlap, you've got a pressure wave coming back up that trumpet. So with the 12 cylinders, you end up with a very high amplitude pressure wave moving up and down the plenum. And it's important to synchronize a pressure wave moving towards a trumpet at the time the trumpet is breathing in, rather than the time it's breathing out. So there's a lot of engineering going into the shape, and the interior shape particularly, to get the pressure wave in the right place during the right cycle. But then also the loads on the plenum. It's not just a thin shell containing air. This is several skins of carbon. The construction is really just like a race car tub, so it's several skins of carbon and then aluminium honeycomb and then more skins of carbon on the inside, because it's like considerable peak pressures having to be contained within that structure.
Talking about sort of what materials are we looking at here in terms of sort of the engine as a whole?
We sort of purposely didn't choose anything, if you like, space age that doesn't have that data in place yet for how will that material be behaving in 50 years' time. So we've relatively conventional materials, but kind of at the cutting edge of those materials. So the cylinder head, for example, cast aluminium alloy, but it uses an aerospace alloy, which has a fatigue life better than a conventional casting alloy. But it's an alloy that isn't even used typically in motorsport. It's very hard to cast, it's very expensive. This is one of the few engines in the world where you could sensibly use it.
And then internally, presumably, there's still titanium and that sort of thing?
Yes, it's titanium rods and titanium valves. In the motor racing world, for an engine delivering these sort of performance figures, you would use leaded bearings. But of course, in the road-going automotive space, you're not allowed to use leaded bearing shells. So we have bearing shells with a polymer overlay, which again, that's at the very cutting edge of what polymer overlay bearings can do, because the load is too high for a conventional aluminium bearing, so we've gone for the polymer overlay bearings.
And that, I suppose, brings us on to the testing. We're standing, I suppose you should say where we are standing.
So we're in one of three test cells, test cell 9, that we've used for this program. We've been running for about a year, and we've been running on 3 cells. One of them has been doing calibration for the emissions calibration, one's been doing performance development, and the other's been doing durability running. So kind of setting out into this program, it's absolutely a flagship car for Aston Martin. It's not a track day special. And so every part of that has to be a proper, for want of a better description, road car. You have to be able to get in it and punch the button and drive it to the shops if you want to. You have to be able to get in and drive to Monaco if you want to. So it had to be tested in that proper, if you like, real world durability. And the target we set ourselves was 100,000 kilometres. Because you've got to prove that. And this is where we prove it on the dyno cells. So the endurance test for the engine is 220 hours, and that 220 hours, we've done lots of simulation to say that the duty cycle in the 220 hours simulates 100,000 kilometres of probable real-world road use. The durability testing is partly Silverstone laps, partly Nürburgring laps, partly very high-duty road testing, but then also sitting on the motorway at 70 miles an hour, because actually
that's where resonances
exactly we were talking earlier about the resonances that go through the gear train. You can't push all of those resonances outside of the rev range. You have to make sure they're therefore in a part of the rev range where you're not going to be sitting continuously.
Yes,
we've had one engine that's gone through that full test, and that was the second one, and when you just hear it running for 20 or 30 seconds, to think that it's done 220 hours of that.
That's extraordinary. Because we're looking at piston speeds of...
Piston speeds are about 25, 26 metres per second, which is up with Formula 1 speeds.
And in terms of usability as well, you were saying the clutch is obviously, I know you end sort of at the end of the engine, but at the flywheel as well. But
yeah, I think, as I say, it's got to be everyday usable. And you know, if you're sitting in traffic, there's, and I'm sure we've all seen it, and you've probably experienced it in some supercars, but you know, you can end up in that sort of kangaroo hopping.
Because a carbon clutch would obviously be the easiest solution, but...
Exactly, so we've actively shied away from that, and so it's very important to have the smallest, lightest clutch we could, and the lowest inertia, because that's very important for the crank dynamics. Obvious solution would be a carbon-carbon clutch. Carbon-carbon clutches are notoriously sort of light switch on and off. And again, it was very important that didn't happen, that you could actually sit in traffic and you could pull away cleanly. So we ended up using a sintered clutch, which I say has been a more painful engineering solution because it's slightly bigger and higher inertia, but it will give a better driving experience.
And we should obviously say that this is part of a hybrid system, and you see where various bits are going to be attached to this. Yes. So eventually we'll get to the details of that next year.
The hybrid part of it was an integral part of the design from the beginning. Electric motors, of course, are fantastic devices because they're full torque from stationary, basically. And so certainly the way the vehicle drives, the way it pulls away, is dramatically assisted by the electrification element, because so you have an internal combustion engine going from 1,000 RPM to 11,000 RPM, huge rev range spread. And so the electrification element is critically important in the way the vehicle's going to drive and the way it's going to feel.
Thank you so much. It's been
Pleasure.
Fantastic getting all the details of this. I can't wait to hear it out on the road.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, it's going to be a thrill to see it and hear it on the road.
Brilliant. Thank you. So there we are, the incredible, the beautiful V12 for the Valkyrie. All those numbers, all those details, they're just so cool. But the one thing that's really going to live with me is the sound, hearing it on that dyno. Those cells are meant to be soundproof. Only things like F1 engines or World Superbike engines can be heard out with them. And that engine revving to 11,000 RPM. We're going to find out all sorts of other technical details over the next sort of weeks, months. The aero, the suspension, the hybrid system. But for now, what I'm really pleased about is that that engine, the heart of the car, passes the crucial test. Makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up.
If you'd like to see a film on Aston's current V12 flagship, the DBS, then just click on the link to the left. And if you're keen to keep up to date with all future Valkyrie developments, just hit the subscribe button. Thank you very much.